people who are off stage who may jump in, and I will also invite you all to jump in as we go. This is a conversational kind of format, so we're going to start off asking some questions, and then hopefully we're just going to kind of go off and run with it. And if you all want to jump in, raise your hand, and we'll try and fit you in. So we started the last session talking about what is negotiation and why does it matter? Does it help or not? And my summary, and I'll welcome people to contradict me, is that it's not clear what the heck negotiation is. We talked about a very broad definition of negotiation in contrast to what often we think of, which is sort of for law school, for law students and lawyers, sort of the very end of a litigation process or the very end of a negotiation or a transaction, but we talked about it as being a very broad set of things that go well beyond that. We also talked about the difficulties of what good is negotiation theory, and maybe negotiation theory that we have all accepted is wrong. And so that's actually the tip-off for this session, which is talking about problems with existing theoretical frameworks. And I described in the last session about how I used to teach here, and I would teach the traditional negotiation theory, and I would see quizzical looks on the faces of my students, and I wondered, was that because there were problems with the students in understanding this clearly sensible material, or was it because I was a lousy instructor, or was it because there were problems in the underlying theory? And in particular, one of the foundational concepts of negotiation theory is something that you all probably have been instructed in if you're already 2Ls or 3Ls, and maybe even if you're in the lawyering class, and I don't know if you've gotten to, have you gotten to negotiation yet? Okay, so we've taught you about there are lots of names for it: interest-based and positional negotiation, or integrative and distributive negotiation. Basically, one is a more cooperative approach, often called integrative. The idea is that we would share interests and come up with something that would work for both of us, or distributive, where it's a win-lose, zero-sum notion. So if Rafael and I are negotiating over who's going to get a certain sum of money, and the more I get means the less that Rafael would get, that's a distributive negotiation. And that's a fundamental concept in our negotiation theory. And so I'm going to start off with Andrea to ask whether that conception should be celebrated as negotiation theory's greatest accomplishment, whether it is completely wrong and should be banned from negotiation theory, should it be appreciated as a once useful but now outdated framework, or, as Rafael suggested, should it just be received with an intellectual shoulder shrug? So what's your answer?
Yes.
All right. We've solved that problem.
Right, we're done. Next question.
Yes.
So this dichotomy drives me crazy as well. I think we teach it and we continue to teach it because it's simple. And then once we've outlined it, we spend the rest of the class saying, but don't get stuck in it. Don't pay attention. Ignore it. That's not actually the reality of how things work. So it drives us crazy. I think it was a really good way of thinking about game theory at the height of the Cold War. And I think we want to understand when it was developed in light of what was going on and who developed it and why. So it's a historical theory, and it's interesting. And we should learn it. Does that mean, no, it shouldn't be banned? Yes, we should appreciate it. And I think we should teach it as that, and practically not really helpful except for kind of day one of helping you organize your life. Because really what we want to be teaching, and I think what we end up teaching, is that negotiation is a continuum. And it is all the way from that really solely distributive, in which it is monetary, more for me is less for you, we're never seeing each other again, I never want to see you again, there is nothing else that matters, and those are really very rare, to the totally integrative, look, there are like 50 different elements and we're magically going to have shared interests in all of them, and let's just figure, okay, that's also a nice little fantasy. And the reality is we're always in the messy middle. So I don't think it's all that. I think we have to teach it. It's helpful. It's in all of our books, and there needs to be much more.
Rishi wants to jump in.
So I want, and well, one of the
And
other.
I made Rishi, I should say, write an article about this.
Well,
so
yeah.
it's totally mean that now I'm like, thank you, write that article that I'm totally going to tell you shouldn't have.
Well, yeah, Andrea sent me up for a trap in her field book, which is like, hey, could you write the integrative distributive one? And she's like, you could write. I remember this quote actually. She's like, yeah, you could just, you could write that in your sleep. And so I started, and then I started realizing, oh, I'm kind of run into all of these problems. And one of the problems I ran into is actually something that you had identified in an article about your skills paradigm. One of the problems with the theory is that we use it to, how many people here have heard the integrative, distributive, problem solving, whatever. Okay, so we use it to refer to many things and we're really sloppy about it. And actually, you were kind of, even here, you were a little bit sloppy about it. Do we refer to issues as integrative? Like, this is an integrative negotiation, this is an integrative issue, or is it a distributed issue? We also use it to refer to the mindset that we bring to the problem, which is, should we be trying to create value or distribute value? Is just the fact that there is integrative potential is a mindset we bring to it. And then there's also the techniques or the tools we use. Right? In a negotiation, I'm going to ask you about your interests. That might be a tool I use if I'm more of an interest-based versus distributive type bargaining. Right? So we're really messy about, even if it is a theory, even if it is useful, we're really messy about what we mean by it. Right? And I think there's a difference between, we need to tell students, or we need to tell anybody, any negotiator, hey, think about what the other side wants or needs, right? And that actually, for some people, is just a complete revelation in the way they think about negotiation, right? I've had people come and talk to me about like, well, I really want this and this and this in my negotiation. What can I do about it? I'm like, okay, well, what do you think the other side wants? And they look at me like, what? I'm like, yeah, what would convince the other side to give that thing that you want to you? And it just like, right? And so like that is a mindset switch that I think is helpful. And then we can talk about tactics or moves or whatnot that you do in negotiation. And then we can also talk about, hey, is this the type of thing, whether it's a planning issue or whatever, as you were saying, that is amenable to some of these moves or these sorts of interests. And that I think we need to really start to be really careful about before we just say, hey, this is the dichotomy, use it.
So this is an interesting set of definitions, right? I happen to think that distributive and integrative are useful, but exactly for the reason that you brought up, which is to tell people to sort of change the mindset because it's not something that comes naturally. And in fact, this whole teaching always of distributive and integrative came about because people have to begin with a distributive mindset, like they go to a flea market and try to negotiate something, and if you are not playing it distributive, you're going to be taken to the cleaners. And so people learn negotiations mostly that way, and then they approach every negotiation with this mindset, and we have to change it. And in the battle to change it, we've come to all these other things where, at least in my mind, it's really simple. If we're negotiating over only one concrete issue, not a relationship, one issue, it is distributive by definition because there's no other way, right? But even a situation like this, you can make it into an integrated by adding issues. But if it's the one issue, that's it, okay? But as Andrea said, there are very few under the sun like this, and people's tendencies to handle even I call it integrative potential. It depends on how you play it. It's your choice. If you don't know how to play it and you play it distributively, it's going to be tough. But actually, we need to tell people, but you could play it integratively in this way. And I think that distinction is useful. And it's also not that fuzzy in my mind. The minute there is more than one issue, you can play it integratively. Your choice, but you can. So when I say choice, it's because I see these as strategies, right? They're not goals. I don't wish for cooperation in my life. I don't strive for it. I don't tell people you should cooperate. It never comes out of my mouth. I say, here are some choices. Think really carefully about what's going to bring what you desire to you faster. And often it is cooperation, right? So I think that ties into what you were saying, that cooperate, yeah, it's a strategy, it's not a goal, and you need to know how to use it. And by the way, people need to know how to use distributive. Why? Because one of the failures that I think we have in the whole negotiation field is that we don't tell people too often what to do if the other hasn't read the book or hasn't taken a course from us. And so they play it distributively, and then what do you do?
Which lawyers deal with all the time.
Right.
David, I know you wanted to jump in about this, and I'm curious if you think that these concepts are helpful in the real world.
No, in a word. For the last year or two, I've been trying to find out what negotiators actually do. Not an easy task. It's not just oh wow, there's this thing over here and we should look at it. But it is possible to make some progress. And my experience interviewing negotiators, reading a great deal about people who study real negotiations in great depth. I don't mean the one-liners. There's a whole lot of writing in which people say, the negotiator in that case told me that he used this technique. I largely discount those kinds of statements. But if you read, to make it simple, 300 or 400 pages about a negotiation, and you find out about, someone was talking earlier about context, as if it's sort of backdrop. When I read these things, context is the negotiation. That's what people are working with. The stuff of what we call context, as if that's the setting and then you negotiate. That's not what you see them doing. You see them using, if you will, context. Using a concept we don't deal with very much, stamina. Who can last longest? Now that's a fairly crude concept, but it turns out to have a whole lot to do with how negotiations really run and how they come out. So that I would recommend, I think part of the problem we had in the first panel, part of the problem we had in this field, is that theorists talk to theorists, teachers talk to teachers. There's a lot of study about what syllabi we all use. I contributed stuff to syllabi. I, of course, have been teaching for years. So I'm part of the group that's been saying, let's just keep talking to teachers and learn from other teachers. I'm recommending that the field shift, not 100%, but that there be a major emphasis on what do negotiators do? What have they done? That's not the end of the conversation, because presumably we might want to say there are better ways to do it. But one of the things we can learn from what negotiators do is, what are their boundaries? What are the intrinsic, and I think there are some intrinsic limitations to what we would call a negotiation. There are boundaries, there are not resistance points, it gets us off to another track, sorry. There are points at which we can't get past. And I think we should be studying what those limitations are, what it is negotiators really do, and the notion that what we do is useful to them. I have to tell you, you can't see it by reading what those folks do. If you read, I'll recommend one book. You walk out of here with one thing today. The best book I've ever read about negotiations, called 13 Days in September. It is about the Camp David negotiation, 1978, with the President of Egypt, the Prime Minister of Israel, and the President of the United States. It is a 350-page book, brilliantly written, the most accessible book you'll ever find. It's written by a guy who writes for the New Yorker, so he does know how to write. And it gives you more depth, more complexity, more understanding of what negotiating, in that case. I don't mean to say you can infer all you need to know about negotiating from a single case. But it is a spectacular example of a person really trying to understand why people took the positions they did, what made changes, what didn't make changes, what efforts worked, what efforts didn't work. And you have to, at least as I read it, you can't find a single one of the things that I teach in that book. Not one. Even though there's a passing reference to a particular tool, the single negotiating text, in a sense it's fake. They say they're using it and they're not. That is, at minimum, the book is chastening. It's a book that says, wow, if they didn't use it and that was a successful negotiation, what does that say about other stuff? And then we ought to be looking for other examples in other places. Last comment. Things that are written up are big worldwide negotiations. So they consume a lot of energy, a lot of people care, their life and death. Understandable. We have no decent writing about a divorce negotiation or a commercial negotiation. or a community. When I say decent, I mean 200 pages of interviewing people, really seeing what they're doing, why they're doing, piece by piece by piece, that aren't taught, that aren't created for the purpose of saying, and therefore you should use botany. They tend to be written backward from the technique to the facts. I'm suggesting we go the other way. And I was telling John last night, I'm trying to get into that level of depth in a domestic, what the rest of us would think about as an ordinary negotiation. Obviously for the parties it's not ordinary, but for all of us it would be ordinary. I want to find out, what do ordinary negotiators actually do in sort of a minute by minute, or as best one can get, a minute by minute.
I want to just briefly mention to everyone here and those watching at home that we had a series of on virtual book club conversations on the Indisputably blog, and there are 20 posts, one of which was a conversation between David and me about this wonderful book, 13 Days in September, which is not very long and it's quite engaging. The book itself, not to mention the mix-up that, yes.
Our conversation is really engaging.
Yes, so if that intrigues you, you can read a very short description on the Indisputably blog, search for David Matz, and you'll pick that up. Rafael, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, and I think we probably are shifting topics soon, so let me just come to the defense of the distributive integrative model. Perhaps not the model, maybe the book from where it comes, which is Walton and McCarthy's book from 1965. And a couple of things to point out. That book was written in the context of labor negotiations. In fact, the title is A Behavioral Theory of Labor Negotiation and Analysis of a Social Interaction System, and responsive to prior work in the industrial relations field by John Dunlop, we basically talk about system theory as applied to labor negotiations. So they were responding to a very specific problem, which I think goes to the issue of context. And they, I think, did a lot of what I think David is suggesting, where they talk to folks and they look at negotiations and they study negotiations. And the context really, I think, drove a lot of what they were saying. And Chris might know more about this from his experience as a labor arbitrator and mediator. But my sense is, as I understand it, that after their book came out, the major criticisms were not from practitioners. I mean, I think they thought that the book was pretty truthful to what the labor collective bargaining process was, but it was from academics, particularly from other disciplines that didn't agree with their approach. I think it's also important to know that in their book, they talk not only about distributive and integrative bargaining, but they talk about two other kinds, attitudinal and interorganizational, which again, in the context of labor relations, was a masterful, I think, approach to understanding that particular context. So in a sense, that takes us a little bit to the conversation this morning, where developing conceptual models or theories of negotiations is so independent on the actual context.
I want to jump in with my own comments and see where we go from there. I posed a question to Andrea to start off. You know, what should we do with this integrative distributive conception? Should we celebrate it? Should we ban it? I'm in the banning camp. I think, and I meant to bring, I have a book that I wrote, and I have a second edition. And in the first edition, I have a chapter with, you know, just a straight summary of traditional negotiation theory. And in the second edition, I have a brief discussion saying, here's what the traditional theory is, and it stinks, it's crazy, you're going to get confused for many of the reasons that Rishi is talking about, so you should be aware of it, but stay the heck away from it. You know, people talk about that, and it doesn't describe the real life for many of the reasons that David has talked about. So my advice to the law students here, and those of you who are watching at home, stay away from that like the plague. This is crazy. It doesn't describe the real world from my perspective. So I would just
remember, he's not grading your final exam.
When you're writing your final exam, if that's what your instructor wants, that's what you should say. But I guess I want to sort of pick up on David's point, because it's interesting, because David and I agree on this sort of fundamental notion that our theory doesn't describe the real world very well. We may have differences about sort of how you would go about actually doing that, but I guess I want to turn to the question of, to the extent that these, how, you know, do you agree with me that these frameworks, that one and others that we've described in our writings, reflect that what negotiators actually do, and to the extent that it doesn't, how and why does the negotiation theory depart from reality? Or another way of thinking of it is, to the extent that negotiators who have been taught negotiation theory, like you all, don't follow it in practice, which is most of the time, why not? Is it because you're not very good at it, because we're not very good instructors, or because there's some problem with the theories? So I guess this is related, the general issue is about sort of theory and reality. So Sanda wants to.
So I'm just curious about how do we know that people don't do it? Because just because they don't attach the labels, I dare a real good negotiator in almost any context to walk in without having in mind what they would do if it doesn't pan out. We just call it BATNA, which is a rotten name. But how would you, I just beg my students from the day I tell them about it, never to walk into a negotiation without doing, knowing what they're going to do otherwise, right? So I want to know, how do we know that they don't use stuff that's similar?
David's going to answer that.
Wait, so,
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry.
first of all, I spend my life interviewing people who have participated in consensus building and other kinds of public negotiations. So I do hear about this stuff, and it seems to be pretty similar to what we say people are doing, right? So that I think that the theory sort of emerged from thinking about what do the successful ones do. So this is an important point. The people who are not using anything, because now we have proof that they don't, I want to know, were they successful? Because what we want to know is, does it bring the big camp? Like, did you do what you wanted and you just didn't follow any prescription? You walked in without any information. You just didn't know what you would do otherwise. You hit hard even though you were going to meet this person again next day. Like, what is it that they don't use?
Well, they may not use the theories that we teach in our textbooks and in our classes. In the first session, Chris was talking about his experience with lots of negotiators. He was a labor mediator and arbitrator for many years, and he was saying that he dealt with people who came in with all sorts of theories, which probably were not the ones that we teach. And some of them we thought were bogus, some of them may not have been. David, I know you wanted to jump in, and then I know Andrea and Rishi, so mix it up.
I think the issue is not so much whether they use our vocabulary as whether you can see at work, let's say, creating value and distributing, distributive work, collaborative work. And I think it's really hard to see there. And it's not that they won't tell you that or what have you, it's what they seem to be doing. Now, that only opens the question, so what are they doing? Which is the interesting question, not whether they're doing what we tell them to. Can we learn from them? First, what they are doing in successful ones, but also can learn from failures. But also trying to figure out, as I suggested, I guess, before, what are the boundaries? I think there are some definitions, not because we can make them up, but if there are people doing something we call a negotiation, is that free-form? They can do anything at all? Or are there some limits in there in the nature of relationship, the nature of power distribution, the nature of my wanting goals and you having goals, in the nature of what I think we'd all agree is got to be there to call it a negotiation? Does that set up some limitations on what's possible to get done, or at least what's difficult to get done? And it seems to me those are the interesting questions that we should be working on. And I'm less concerned now with, are we teaching the right stuff? Now, just one last footnote about teaching. We teach because there are certain requirements of teaching. For example, one has to start somewhere. If one starts with, don't pay any attention, this is a muddle. Short class, right? Low enrollment. So there are
No wonder I never got students in my class.
Well, I was trying to get there, John. I think it's important to give students some clarity at the beginning, to do exactly what you were saying, and then critiquing. I think that's exactly what we ought to be doing. Not dismissing what we just said, but just say, okay, we started somewhere. Students need to get a handle on something, they need to be able to work with something, and then they need to test it. And part of our job is to help them figure out how to do the testing. How do you find out whether this is any good? We may give them our critique, we may just at least legitimate the notion that critiquing what I just said is exactly what we want you to be doing in this process. That's not easy. That's not easy in any educational system. But it does seem to me that's our job.
You all wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Maybe when we're thinking about what's actually used or how do we know that it's working, I mean, I don't think trying to test like, oh, are they following integrative versus distributive? Or are they following problem solving? I don't even know what that means. I mean, that is, and you know, John and I argued for a while. I have an article that was originally titled Labels Suck. And then we decided that that was not professional enough and it's titled something else. But that really is what I think about this. The labels suck, that we just get confused and it doesn't mean anything. And how does any of us know that we're actually, I'm integrative right now. I don't know what that means. What I think we actually want to be focusing on, both in our teaching and in our testing, if it's working, are what do we mean under that? What is a good opening? How do we build rapport with the other side, right? So I'm sure in the reports, and I know from 13 Days and George Mitchell and right, the success stories on the ground absolutely are talking about reputation and ethical behavior and establishing rapport. So how do we actually train you students, or any of us, to go and build rapport? Right, and that sounds fuzzy too. So it's like, hey, when you go into a client's office and you see a big fish on the wall, duh, ask them about the big fish, right? That builds rapport. And we're really getting to the practical basis of what that means in terms of becoming a better negotiator. Because we can, I think, drill down and look at those specific skills. And it is the skill set at the end of the day that I think we can test and that we should be teaching. And the labels, it's nice to give a framework. That's not going to get it.
And to build on that, I want to draw a distinction between sort of there's the framework, right? There's the integrative distributive framework, which is, I guess I think of it as a mindset or approach or whatever you want to call it, right? Like just thinking about the other side. But then to go on that drilling down bit, this is again where I think theory can really inform, right? So I don't play chess very well. I play chess very badly, actually. But when they study expert chess players, right, versus really novice chess players play like one move at a time. Whereas really expert chess players look at the board and they can see patterns and they have pattern recognition. And one of the reasons that you read chess books is because you read about openings and you find, oh, this opening is a series of moves. And so they can hold and chunk more information and hold it up in their head. And Dave, to go back to what you're saying, I mean, if we look at 13 Days or some of these other things, I think that one of the things that theory can help us do, maybe not integrative distributive per se, but things like, oh, okay, this person is making a move, this person is making a particular type of thing, they're doing a thing. Oh, they're anchoring, right? And if we can teach students, or we can teach anybody, hey, this is anchoring, if you're just even aware, if you can put a label on something, you can chunk that information in your head. And I've got 4 things that I teach. Like, okay, if somebody starts out with a really high anchor, here are 4 things that you can do. And if they don't have that, and I would still call that theory. I would still call, and maybe you'll disagree with me in a second. But if they don't have that theory about, okay, this is anchoring, I can put a label on it. Once I put a label on it, I can think about how to respond to it. Versus if I'm just kind of like a naive chess player, naive negotiator. Oh, they just came up with a really high number. What do I do? I think that, I don't know if you'd want to call that theory or not, but I would still say that having that information in your head, whatever you want to call that, you want to call it theory or framework, whatever, is going to help you respond to it because you have some label for it. Agree, disagree?
Does it help to distinguish between our job as teachers and our job as scholars, thinkers, trying to understand what's happening? That is, we have obligations, and I think you've really nailed a number of them in terms of who's in front of us and what they're here for and what we should be given. As distinguished from when we're talking together, as we are presumed to be now, saying, yeah, but it's not just that we don't see it there. What's the way we should think about this? Which might later turn into something that gets taught. But it seems to me it's a prior set of exercises about how can we think about it better In terms of effectiveness, sure. In terms of accuracy of application, sure. In terms of improving behaviors, whether it's the design of the negotiation or the training of the negotiators or whatever our angle on the process is there a way that we can think better? Which might be a very different question than can I teach it in class tomorrow? Is it the kind of thing I can hand my students? Will it answer the question, what do I do with a high opening on the other side?
Sanda, I know you wanted to jump in.
So I am with Go Labels because they help me, so it's personal. But I keep hearing you saying that it's all fuzzy and meaningless, but I'm gonna be ready, anybody who's asking, I have a clear definition of what it is. So maybe, it may be mine, it's my mental model, but it's not like it's all fuzzy. It's fuzzy when you sort of look at it and you don't want labels. So that's okay. The other thing that is going to bore you to tears is that context matters. And in other words, what happened with the 13 days is not going to inform somebody who's looking for a job and negotiating for conditions, right? Right. So, or it's not in the same way. And the third thing that I want to propose is a little mental model of mine that says the higher the stakes, the less the piddly stuff matters. So anybody who's been in a faculty meeting knows it's about nothing. And we walk out of there not talking to each other because it's about nothing. It's all relationship, piddly, and you can talk about rapport, and he looked at me, and he yelled, and all that. By the time you get to Carrie and Lavrov, if they pay attention to rapport, I want them dismissed, because they need to pay attention to what they're negotiating and they failed miserably, right? Does everybody agree? So I don't want them paying attention to rapport. Really, I want them to figure out a way to get to what we all care, the whole world, right? Watching what's happening in Syria. So there's a range of priorities and stakes loom larger, and tangible stakes loom larger the higher up you go. And in between are all the negotiations that we all engage in. And in those, yes, rapport matters. So for instance, in my field, you live in a community, you negotiate today about some polluted river, tomorrow you're negotiating about the highway, it's the same people in the room. If you spat at somebody last time, they're there again, okay? So you definitely need rapport. You always negotiate with the same people. So context matters, and things matter differentially, I think, and it's important to remember this. And Go Labels.
Go ahead.
You raised a question for David. Because, I mean, you raised an intriguing problem, and in part, I think, is methodological, or sort of how we go about developing theory in a sense. So we go to, we observe this negotiation. Do we commit with a set of parameters of what we are looking, or do we just sit there and listen and then organically, I guess, come up with the concept? So, I mean, that's a difficult question. I don't mean it in a flip manner, but so what is your sense as to how do we get there?
I think, as you say, this is a fundamental problem of all social science research, basic methodologies. And I think the answer that I've always liked is that it's interactive. Of course we come in with models. There's no way to walk into any room without. But we do our best in a variety of methodological ways to cross-check. So I look at it, then John looks at it. If John sees something different, first thing I say is he doesn't know anything. The second thing I say is, well, maybe. So there is some room for finding cross-checking, either by myself, with others. The nice thing about a book like, and I don't want to hammer 13 days because it's got all sorts of issues, is that many people can read it. There would be a fascinating discussion, a panel discussion, or an article with 4 people reading that book, saying, what did you see in this about negotiating that was interesting, that might be useful, that might be surprising? I mean, any number of criteria to get us to try and, in one sense, articulate the biases we come with. That's another way of framing it. Of course, you're right. But maybe getting it challenged. So that at least I've got to be a little more open to maybe my blind spots in seeing it. And John and I have had conversations already about that, where he and I differ. And I found it enormously useful in just a handful of emails. John has done work interviewing lawyers about their cases. I thought that was wonderful stuff. I just wanted the interviews to be 10 times as long.
Now that he's retired, he can do
Well,
that.
that's good. I was trying to say that, right? I didn't have the nerve to be as direct as you are.
Well, I want to jump in on this. First, I just want to note that Sanda has articulated a theory of faculty meetings, which is their Seinfeld. They're all about nothing. So now we have that settled. I guess I want to go back to this question about the usefulness of labels and theory, and I guess my problem with it is that it brainwashes you. And so you think you know what you're seeing, you go in with these labels, and then often life doesn't work that way. And so I guess I really aligned myself with David in terms of, and part of this came out of the fact that I did do these interviews. You know, they lasted about a half an hour, 20 minutes, a half an hour, and you know, I got a fairly detailed account, not as detailed as in 13 Days in September, but I learned a lot about how negotiation worked, and the fact that these labels didn't fit very well. And I think about, you know, so if you talk to, you know, and you know, we have an audience here mostly of law students, you know, if you looked at and talked to lawyers actually negotiating, I think that they would, you know, these concepts that we teach you, just not even on their radar. And I think about, for example, in the mediation context, we teach about facilitative and evaluative mediation, and you know, they don't talk about that, they don't think about it that way, so we come in with a whole bunch of concepts that are appealing that don't reflect well, I don't think, what goes on in the real world, and actually can be confusing, and that may be the reason why, in practice, I think they're ignored. Andrew's going to correct me.
Excellent. And my guess is, having not seen the transcripts, that we would recognize plenty of the skills that we teach under each of those labels. So when you were teaching distributive or how to be successful in distributive negotiations, you better be teaching how to be assertive and how to make your argument and how to prep your case and how to frame it. And I would guess that the lawyers, when they were actually talking about the negotiations, said something to the effect of, here's my legal preparation, and here's, you know, I was cognizant of what the court would do, and here's how I said the argument in order to talk to the other side. And similarly, if we are looking at under integrative, my guess is they ask questions of the other side. And of course, we're talking about how do you ask questions, how do you gather information, and all of those things. So I don't expect that somebody going into a mediation is necessarily going to say, and now I shall be facilitative and switching to evaluative and blah, blah, blah. But if we identified all of the behaviors underneath that, we're going to be able to track a mediator in action doing that.
Well, in some ways, I guess what that gets back to, in my mind, is Rishi's point about, you know, that you need some theory. It's not that you're going to come in with a completely blank slate. It's just that the theory that we brainwash you, in my mind, is wrong, and that you should try and resist it except when you are taking an exam. Go ahead.
Is it just the integrative distributive theory that we're having a problem with? Is it not? I mean, is it the problem? Are we having problems with other? Are we having problems with skills? Or are we having with which there is a theory of how negotiations go? I mean, you know, I came up with the idea. I started off saying integrative distributive. Like that's not really that useful, or maybe that's not helpful. Maybe it's just helpful as a mindset. And you know, I appreciate your point, David, that like you don't see that in the world. But I guess maybe I want to ask a sort of larger question, which is, to what end do you want to have what theory do you want? Do you want a theory of skills, or do you want a theory of mindset, or do you want a theory of, hey, we can all look at a negotiation and say X about it? I guess maybe I'm not entirely sure to what end do you
Right.
want.
Oh, I think that's a great question. Is to sort of, why are we doing what we're doing? That is, the implication of the move since the Cold War in the direction of negotiating and mediating and what have you, it is definitely one of something's broken, and our job is to find better tools to get it fixed. And the Cold War was simply the largest scare possible to get everybody mobilized. And I think we're still living with that sense that things aren't done well out there. We can teach them to do it better. I don't think we have the data, frankly, on the things aren't done well out there from. It is said, I say it, lots of people say it, I'm not sure we could actually document that. we can find negotiations that fail. Whether they would have, in using our stuff, they would have succeeded, I'm not ready to say. But I do want to pick up on a point that John, our field loves to give examples of success that we have been responsible for. 1973, Israel fought a war, among others, with Egypt. War ends. Israel is surrounding the Egyptian Third Army, and there's a lot of tension about how they're going to resolve that problem. Henry Kissinger goes over and does shuttle diplomacy, resolves it. Dozens of citations in our field saying that what Kissinger did was find interests, not positions, and because he found the interests, he could find a way to produce an integrative agreement. The simple thing to say is that's false. That's not what happened. There are 4 really good write-ups of that negotiation or mediation, all of which make clear that what happened was Israel was in the catbird seat. They owned all the variables. They got 9. They asked for 8 things. They got 7 of them. And Kissinger came up with the idea of giving Sadat a flag to wave as a fig leaf. And Sadat took it because he had no choice. This was not interests. This was a power negotiation in which one side got everything, or almost everything they wanted. The other side got nearly nothing because the power circuit, at that moment, Sadat had lost the war. And that was he didn't have any leverage with either the Israelis or the Americans, really, at that point. So my point is we need to be careful about how we cite victories, how we cite accomplishments of our field. And there's a lot of it. We do a lot of that stuff by grabbing a few sentences out of an example and saying, see, that's an example of where they used something that we teach. So, caution.
Okay.
No, I mean, I guess I'm curious as we're talking about this. Where should we find these things? So, at the turn of the century, it's fun to be able to say that. So, at the turn of the last century, it was all of 16 years ago, right? So, I asked lawyers, right? So mine was not the interviewing 32 lawyers. It was a survey of about 700 lawyers, evaluating the lawyer on the other side, because I'm not talking to the client. You can't do that. I mean, you could, but we can't do that. And asking one lawyer to rate the other on what makes that lawyer an effective negotiator. And then kind of tying it to adjectives, different behavioral moves, so on and so forth. So it's lawyers assessing lawyers, and then looking at effectiveness, which again is a perceptual thing. They have to make a good guess as to effectiveness. But it was also looking at failure, right? They were able to write up stories like, I made an offer of $10,000 and they turned it down and then got smacked with sanctions at the court. Fun things like that, where you get the failures. And so, is that good enough? Is that where do we find these stories anyway? As to what is, and again, there's no overarching theory. I mean, that article doesn't go and say, integrative, distributive. It says these are the things that seem to be integrative, and when you do a cluster analysis, any statisticians in the audience, can I say whatever I want? Okay, excellent. Cluster analysis, whatever, blah, 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 is all you hear. So cluster analysis, right, that comes up with the categories of what seems to work in terms of behavior and what doesn't seem to work. At least one lawyer guessing as to what another lawyer is doing.
And that lawyer talking to you. That is, that's what the lawyer is doing in that moment. Your data is what the lawyer tells you about what she thinks the other lawyer was doing.
Encapsulating an entire case in a set of adjectives.
Okay, so the only thing I would say is, the implication of your question is it's really hard to get at that data, and I couldn't agree more. I think, it's not because we're lazy, it's because it's really hard to get that data. No, I'm serious. We have relied on a set of assumptions and stories, which I think have misled us. But it's not because I think, okay, everybody get up and do this following 10-step thing, and we're going to get these great reports like 13 days applied to 25 cases. I think it's really hard to do. I'm trying to do some of them now. So I can be a frontline player telling you how hard it is, not yet one who can succeed. But it is really hard to get those things because you've got to get people to tell you what they're doing more or less in real time. You've got the delicacy that if they're negotiating and you're asking questions, you're influencing that negotiation. Not because you intend to, but because the questions themselves get people to think about things they wouldn't otherwise be thinking about. So there are a lot of delicacies, some ethical, some practical, some intellectual, all of which are really very difficult. So I don't pretend I've got the neat answer. And anybody who's gone as far as you've gone or as far as John's gone has moved us further down the road. I don't mean to deprecate the efforts to go that far. I just think it's still very incomplete, and I'm pushing for another level of knowledge of these things.
I want to kind of sum up here, which is to say there are problems with negotiation theory, which is really what the theme of this panel has been. And we aren't even clear what those problems are and what the theory should be or how we would go about that. And so I implore you to stick around for the next panel starting at 11 o'clock when we will solve all these
problems.
Thank you very much. We'll see